Dr. DiBennardo. I am a sociology PhD candidate here at UCLA. I'm happy to be here to talk to you about part of my dissertation. I always tell people my dissertation, whenever they ask about my dissertation, I'm like, okay, it's about sexual predators. It's not necessarily a happy topic, but I do find it very interesting, particularly because in the past 20 years, in the state of California, we've seen a growth of extremely punitive sex offender laws. We've really seen a growth in them nationwide, but California has probably the most. So my dissertation is actually specifically about the 1996 Sexually Violent Predator Act. So what that did is it created the category of the sexually violent predator, which was a way to classify sexual criminals considered particularly dangerous. So it put into place the Sexually Violent Predator Act, which meant that the criminals who were designated sexually violent predators were then eligible to be civilly committed, and that is sent to mental institutions after serving their criminal penalties for their crimes. So this is usually used with repeat offenders, sort of serial rapists, people considered pathological, according to the DSM, violent sexual predators, and it's used to categorize those who commit any sex crimes at all against those under the age of 14. So what happens is, after you serve your time, you're eligible for parole. They send in two mental health evaluators who then determine if you're eligible to be deemed a sexually violent predator. Then you go to a civil trial where almost everyone is found guilty. And you're sent, if you're found guilty, you're sent to Coalinga State Hospital, which is built specifically to house sexually violent predators. And you're pretty much indefinitely civilly committed. There are 850 people at Coalinga State Hospital. Only 16 have ever been released since the hospital opened. So the question that I'm dealing with here is how, why, and from where did the term sexual predator arise, and how did it come to refer to these specific designations of sexual crime? And I'm conducting, for this part of my dissertation, a media content analysis to look at the sort of rise of the term sexual predator. So the theoretical framework I'm using, D'Amelio points out that definitions and the subsequent regulation of sexual deviance sort of shift and change throughout history. Since we're all gender and sexuality scholars, I'm sure we pretty much know that. And Jenkins argues that no one framing of what constitutes a sexual offense ever represents an objective reality. So rather, the changing frames of what we consider sexually acceptable provide an index of shifting social attitudes. These are toward family values, the tolerance of alternative sexual orientation, the status of children. So a good example of this, when you think about California in 1945, consensual sodomy could get you lobotomized, it could have you committed to a mental institution, several other things, right? So now that's protected under Lawrence v. Texas, but if you're an 18-year-old person who has consensual sex with a 17-year-old person, you can be put on a sex offender registry, you can be subject to outpatient sex offender treatment, all sorts of things, right? So we see these sort of shifting frameworks over the course of the 20th century in California. And the relationship between the media and sex crimes, the further a crime departs from cultural norms, the more newsworthy the crime is usually considered, right? This is particularly relevant in the case of sex crimes because they sort of garner a lot of intense fear and disgust from the public. In addition, in their media coverage of sex crimes, of offenders and victims, the media signals which criminals it considers most dangerous. In addition, and it also signals which victims are ideal victims, which victims are worth protecting. The language of deviance is also really important here. So Jenkins points out that the language of sex crimes reflects the horror of actions considered despicable or dangerous. It's neither value neutral nor uniform. So for example, we have these terms pervert, pedophile, child molester. None of these are really neutral terms, right? So child molester is considered a descriptive term, but it's not really neutral. It evokes a certain emotion from us. And media discourse sort of intensifies the meanings of these terms. So they come to represent monstrous perversion. And the most recent of these is the term sexual predator, which the media and public now routinely use to describe sexual offenders. And I don't know if anybody listened to the news yesterday, but Hillary Clinton is now being called to task for calling certain criminals in the 1990s super predators, which I thought was really interesting. I guess nobody heard about it, but yeah. So she's being criticized for calling certain young people who committed crimes super predators, and so I think it's really interesting this language is coming up again similarly right now. So just a teeny bit more theory, and then we'll go on to the results. So the news media is there's many theories about how the news media interacts with the law and with sex crimes, but one is that the news media is a major way in which therapists, psychiatrists, and legal advocates project their views and findings surrounding sexual deviance. Another is that media representations of crime shape public opinion through the frequency with which they present various types of offenders and victims, which in turn influences criminal justice policies. And then the flip side of that is that the media reflects social problems that are already broadly defined by newspapers. The relationship between media representations of sexual deviance and sexually violent predator laws remains unclear, and that's what I'm exploring here. So I used a media content analysis. Basically, I wanted to see which articles use the exact term sexual predator. I used a sample of news reports on sexual crimes published between January 1st, 1985 and October 5th, 2015 in the LA Times. My current sample is 291 articles. I'm still coding. I should have 350 if I ever finish my final sample. I created 107 codes and variables for analysis. And I created those using existing knowledge of literature surrounding sexual deviance and sexually violent predator laws in the state of California. So I don't have time to talk about everything. So some of the factors that impact the use of the term sexual predator are race, age, sex, gender. There's several political variables and spatial variables. So I'm going to talk about race, sex, gender, the political variables, and the spatial variables just a little bit toward the end of the presentation when I talk about moving forward. And for now, I just want to focus on age, which factored in a lot in my analysis. So the age of victims and the relationship that offenders have with victims factors largely into sexually violent predator legislation. So I hypothesized that there would be a correlation between the use of the term sexual predator and stories about child victims. In particular, we have this idea of America's child, right? So this is sort of a white, upper middle class child. John Benet Ramsey is a really good example of America's child, and the media tends to fixate on these sorts of child victims. And we also have sort of a fixation on stranger danger, which is the idea that most children are going to be abducted by someone in a white van who's going to drive down the street, or they're going to be lured in by people, or they're going to stick something in your Halloween candy. I don't know if you guys remember that. So even though in reality, most abuse against children happens in the home and is by people who know them. Let's see what else. So my preliminary findings regarding age. So of the total number of articles, 61% mentioned the age of victims. And of the articles that did, 70% focused on child victims. And so you have to remember that sexually violent predator laws also address serial rapists and victims of rape. So, but 70% focused only on child victims. And that was defining child victims as anywhere between 0 and 17 years. But because sexually violent predator legislation looks at victims under the age of 14, I looked specifically at that as well. And of those articles that mentioned child victims, 80% of the victims were age 14 or less. In addition, 30% of articles using the term sexual predator mention stranger danger. And like I said before, 4/5 of sexual assaults are committed by those known to victims. So that sort of there's a disconnect there. An interesting finding I wanted to discuss is that there's often articles that have their implications of sex crimes without evidence that victims were actually sexually assaulted. And this happens a lot in the case of child murders, which I found very sort of off-putting. So what happens is, like in the case, for example, we have 10-year-old Michael Anthony Martinez. He was found murdered in the desert. They found his body. The article points out that there was no evidence of sexual assault, and then they have a quote right after that that says, authorities believe that the crime was the work of a practiced sexual predator. So it doesn't really make sense. And then there was a 5-year-old victim in Santa Ana And of course, I'm not saying that these crimes are not terrible. She was she was snatched by a man, and he physically assaulted her. He beat her up, and then he ran away. He did not attempt to remove her clothes. He did not attempt to touch her in any sexual ways. And the article points this out, and then goes on to say that the sexual assault was likely the intent of the crime, even though nothing sexual actually happened. And then we have these sort of classic examples. I don't know if anybody remembers Polly Klaas. She was taken from her bedroom window during a sleepover in Petaluma, California, and she was murdered. And Polly Klaas is often lumped in with child victims that were actually raped, such as Megan Kanka, the child that Megan's Law was named after her, which created sex offender registries. Jessica Lunsford, that was Jessica's Law. And also JonBenet Ramsey is another one who wasn't actually sexually assaulted, but it's often sort of mentioned in coverage about JonBenet Ramsey that maybe she was, or so I don't know. So that's thrown in a lot. So Polly Klaas is one of those. I thought that was interesting. And then I just wanted to talk briefly about age and gender. So I predicted that the majority of stories discussing sexual predators would be about child victims. Particularly those about child victims would be about men, which was the case. But I also found that adult female victims were frequently framed as sexual predators. And this was a strategy used by a lot of defense attorneys. So for example, there was a case that was covered a lot in the media about a teenage acquaintance rape victim. She was a girl who was drugged and raped by 3 of her male friends. And the defense framed her as a sexual predator. So the articles that I found, all of the articles about her were talking about her as a sexual predator. They never referred to the perpetrators as sexual predators. And then there was an article that came out several times about a serial rapist, but one of his victims was a former adult film star, so she was the one who was called a sexual predator. This also came up in some political sex scandals. So in articles about Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, there were only 5 articles where Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton were mentioned together. In 3 of those articles, Monica Lewinsky was a sexual predator. So in 60% of them, she was a sexual predator, not Bill Clinton, which I thought was interesting. So, moving forward, I have a lot more to do. I'm theorizing the role of race that comes up in the media. I need to flesh out the role of gender and sexuality more. There's a lot of political variables that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, particularly sort of what sorts of crimes result in extreme legislation, and who sort of talks about, like which legislators actually talk about these crimes. And then there's a number of spaces I'm looking at. So we have the case of pedophile priests, someone in the church. And I have, like, anecdotally so far, I found that they're very infrequently referred to as sexual predators. I only have about 3 articles so far where a priest has been referred to as a sexual predator who molests children, not just generally, obviously. And then the way that neighborhood surveillance and sex offender registries play into this, as well as the internet, which has, been shows like To Catch a Predator, places where you sort of lure sexual criminals. The internet has been sort of framed as a space that is incredibly dangerous to children. So that's where I'm at, and yeah, thank you.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions for Rebecca.
Really